boy.
Canada.
Canada.
Well, doesn't it derive from a Ganyaka word?
Means village.
As Indigenous people, we are used to our stories getting a little twisted. So listen up as we set the record straight. I'm Ganyetio. Please join me as we hear from dozens of Indigenous people. Together, we will decolonize our words and our minds on the Telling Our Twisted Histories podcast. You can find episodes on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Danse, Anin, Buju. Hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today on Radio Indigenous.
I think of Tuktoyaktuk, which is in the Inuit settlement region. Sea level rise and warmer climates contributing to permafrost thaw are accelerators for homes and part of the community to be literally washing into the sea.
That way of life is threatened. That source of revenue and meat and sustenance is heavily impacted by virtue of climate change.
Take note, climate change is impacting our communities much greater than it is impacting those countries that are causing climate change. And so you have to hear us.
For nearly 3 decades, the United Nations has been bringing together almost every country on Earth for global climate summits called COPs, which stands for Conference of the Parties. COP26 is underway this week in Glasgow, Scotland. Many believe it to be the world's best last chance to get runaway climate change under control. And the Inuit are leading the charge. Climate change is a massive problem that needs to be tackled on all fronts. From the food we eat to the way we get around, it needs advocates and change makers globally and locally. Natan Obed is the president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the organization that represents 65,000 Inuit in Canada. 2 years ago, the ITK released its National Inuit Climate Change Strategy. And Natan is responsible for spreading the word and making it come to life. He joins me from Ottawa. Hello.
Great to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. Now, there is a growing understanding globally of why we need to keep Nunavut cold. But Inuit have, of course, known this for decades. What do you think it will take for the world to actually start hearing this message?
It's a really great question, and it is the question for our future, really. We are already seeing temperatures that are 2.2 degrees over historical temperatures. So we are already exceeding the Paris targets in Inuit Nunagat, our homeland. And we can extrapolate from that the Arctic is warming between 2 and 3 times the global average, depending upon the part of the Arctic in which we're measuring. We need to do so much more to ensure that we reduce our carbon footprint. And we need nation states to be more concerned with climate action. And these COP processes allow for us to come together to discuss the ways in which we get to net zero or to reduce carbon emissions globally. But we still haven't been able to find a way in which to meaningfully address the rate of change that is necessary. And my guess is as good as yours about what will strike the final nerve and see global action in an unprecedented scale. It will come. It's just a matter of when it will come.
What do you think the barriers are to making people around the world understand and care about the North when most people haven't been to the region?
Yeah, that is something that we face every day, not just within climate change policy, but within social policy, within infrastructure concerns. We have a hard time articulating our concerns and our priority areas to our fellow Canadians who understand that there are Inuit and understand that there's an Arctic region in Canada, let alone to a global community. I think that when we see sea level rise, when we see global current patterns change, when we see weather changing in profound ways, and climatologists talking about the impact that the Arctic and the Antarctic have on global weather patterns. Some people can understand that, but for a person who doesn't necessarily care whether it's 5 degrees or 0 degrees in the winter in a part of Europe, it has to hit home somehow. And I think we still struggle to keep that, to say a message that resonates.
Now, the ITK's National Climate Committee developed a strategy for tackling the climate crisis, and it lays out the direct, indirect, and social impacts of climate change on Inuit. Can you give us a sense of just how many facets of your life are impacted by climate change?
Well, I'll start with the right to food and the ability for Inuit to have food security, and I'll give an example. A lot of our traditional practices for harvesting and storing our traditional foods are linked with climate. In the summer, especially when we're trying to dry Arctic char or dry whale or caribou, we need particular conditions for that drying process to be ideal. If it's too hot, the meat will just rot. And so there are many places in Inuit Nunagat where we are hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest freezer. Mm-hmm. And the environment itself is either a freezer or it is a way in which we can use our traditional skills to create food security for our people. So in recent years, it's been much harder to dry, say, Arctic char in our traditional way because of how warm it is on certain days. We also see permafrost thaw that doesn't allow us to cache food in the same way that we have in the past. And many of our traditional practices as well are in relation to fermenting or aging our food that require particular temperatures and particular ground environments for those processes to take place, much like perhaps traditional cheese making in certain parts of the world. And all of these things are being impacted by a warming climate that undermines our ability to live and to prepare foods in traditional ways, and it has then a massive impact on our food security.
Mm-hmm. Is there a person or a community that comes to mind when you think about these kinds of impacts?
Well, I think of Tuktoyaktuk, which is in the Inuvialuit settlement region. Parts of the community are literally washing into the sea. And so sea level rise and warmer climates contributing to permafrost thaw are accelerators for homes and part of the community to be washing into the sea or being close to being washed into the sea. We have a huge infrastructure deficit in our homeland as it is, and I think of the complications that this climate crisis is piling on top of the basic lack of infrastructure that we have, and it's making really difficult situations even worse. I also think about those who have been traveling along traditional pathways in the winter, which are on sea ice, and some people have passed away. Some people have died traveling upon established network systems that have been traveled for generations. But because of a changing climate, there are places that just the ice isn't as thick, or that the current has changed so that there are potential failures in the ice structure that weren't ever there before. So these are the types of life and death scenarios that now people have to navigate and adapt to.
When it comes, these are all serious, situations due to climate change. But what really keeps you up at night when you think about the effect of climate change on Inuit?
Well, I think of the coming generations. I think of in 50 years, what will Inuit Nunagat, what will our homeland look like? What devastating changes might happen if we let climate change run uncorrected globally. Perhaps there won't be the same species that live in the Arctic with us. Perhaps we won't have the same access to drinking water. Perhaps we won't be able to understand the weather and live in harmony with the environment, and also to live on the land in the way that we do now. I see great concerns that elders have in the intergenerational passing on of knowledge. And it really breaks my heart to think that the knowledge that we have coalesced amongst our Inuit society over the past millennia may be undermined by human activity thousands of kilometers away from Inuit Nunagat. Those are the types of things that really worry me in relation to the future. And I do hope that we can do all we can in the present to mitigate against the worst case scenarios.
You're listening to Unreserved. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. My guest is Natan Obed, president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the organization that represents 65,000 Inuit in Canada. And as an organization that represents so many communities in such a vast area of the country, how did you land on the common priorities of your climate strategy?
We worked over the course of 2 years to create the strategy and the particular actions within the strategy, the priority areas. And we did so trying to bring together the things that were common concerns rather than jockeying for positions on things that weren't universally of concern. And we kept coming back to a community-based approach to climate action. Yes, we are concerned about the natural environment and all of the very specific indicators in relation to the natural environment, but we have a primacy of consideration for the way in which Inuit live and the way in which we interact with our environment. And keeping Inuit Nunagat healthy, there is a requirement to keep Inuit society healthy. We have coexisted and have lived within our environment and within the network of all living things for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that was the focus of our particular climate strategy.
And you mentioned priority areas. What are those priorities for Inuit?
Well, first and foremost, it is Inuit communities and the concerns about climate effects on Inuit communities. That could be everything from infrastructure to food security to intergenerational transmission of knowledge. We also then have a consideration for our political place within the conversation and ensuring that Inuit have the right to participate in nation-state conversations, but also international conversations about climate action. We also talk about capacity and the ability to understand a changing climate. So a research capacity, but then also a human resource capacity to be able to empower Inuit to participate within all the considerations that go into climate science and the climate change policy conversation. We also have a great concern for our natural environment and for the systems in place, the marine and terrestrial, that we can influence still to ensure that, as Shiluat Cloutier has said again and again, that Inuit have the right to be cold.
How portable do you think is your strategy? Could this strategy be implemented in other places?
I think for Indigenous people, this could be a strategy that would resonate. Some of the people who have read it and come to me and said, well, I don't understand why the strategy isn't more focused on achieving specific international targets on greenhouse gas emissions or specific environmental considerations. And we say we have those concerns as well. But when we are drafting an Inuit-specific climate strategy, it is one that largely imagines that the world is bringing this challenge to us. Mm-hmm. And a small part of it is, yes, advocating for the things that climate leaders are advocating for globally, especially in net zero or carbon reduction plans. But really, we're getting at the heart of what is most important to an individual Inuk in a community. What are the things that are changing their lives because of climate change? And then how can we best present solutions that meet their needs?
You mentioned net zero and global emissions. Data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that if we can cut global emissions to net zero by 2050, it could bring the warming back to under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement. How optimistic are you that that can be achieved?
I balance my optimism with realism. And we have not shown as a human race the ability to meet any of our climate targets as of yet. Mm. So I feel as though I cannot be entirely optimistic, but I can still hope. And we really have no choice but to continue to hope that something will trigger a massive change in the way that all nation states see climate action as the priority for sustainability of any sort of national or global self-preservation. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting. I hate to draw parallels where they're sometimes because they're not perfect. Mm. But you look at what has happened in the last 6 months, 9 months in this country, in Canada, based on the findings in Kamloops and other residential schools and the finding of remains. I do believe that there was an immediate change in the way Canadians dealt with reconciliation because of the gravity of these findings. And it almost as if a page has been turned and now you get an entire country calling to account the Prime Minister for not respecting the first Truth and Reconciliation Day. And that wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there are inflection points that I believe are coming in this climate conversation. And I'm not sure how bad it has to get and where it needs to get in the globe for there to be a massive reorientation of priority on this area. Mm-hmm. But I just hope that we as Canadians and we as First Nations, Inuit and Métis in this country can continue to push as hard as we can and articulate our concerns as loudly as we can, because it all matters. It all makes a positive difference. Even if we reach one more MP, one more minister, one more business executive, this is how it is all going to turn around. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You just begun your third term as ITK president, and you've said that this will be your last. What do you want to accomplish when it comes to the climate crisis before you leave office in just under 4 years?
I hope to make the particular concerns that Inuit have within the climate crisis Canadian concerns. Canadians understand that there is an Arctic. Canadians understand that there are Inuit who live in the Arctic. I don't think the Canadians truly understand the impact of Inuit Nunagat and the Inuit Nunagat environment on southern Canada and on the very future of this country. We tend to not think of things as being immediate concerns if we are not a part of the particular community or we do not live in the particular geographic footprint of the concern. But there are some things that transcend that. Mm-hmm. So I do believe it's possible for Canadians to truly believe that Arctic warming and climate change in the Arctic is a Canadian concern and not just an Inuit concern. And also that by addressing that particular concern, they are also addressing their own particular concerns in their own communities. The unprecedented environmental crises that we've faced in this year alone, especially with wildfires and droughts, there is still, I don't think, the proper narrative about how we can address the larger picture and how the larger picture affects those particular weather events. Mm-hmm. We're still learning. It takes us a long time. And so I'm not scolding anybody in this country about what you might not understand. But at the same time, we can build a greater understanding, and we really need to. And I want to be there all the way through, articulating the Inuit specific concerns, articulating the Inuit Nunagat perspective, and also being a leader within the Canadian response, not just the Arctic response, but being a passionate advocate with anyone who wishes to join or joining anyone who is showing true leadership in the issue.
Thank you so much for your time today and your thoughts.
Well, I always appreciate talking to you, Rosanna.
Me too. I mean, talking to you, not to myself. That's weird. Natan Obed is president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today on the show, we are talking to Inuit climate activists, young and old, who are fighting for the North and for our planet. It's a long way from Inuit Nunagat to Glasgow, Scotland. But a delegation is making the journey in hopes of keeping Inuit at the center of climate change conversations. COP26 runs from October 31st to November 12th. It's an opportunity for world leaders to move closer to the goals set out by the Paris Agreement. Goals that are essential in keeping global temperatures from rising to irreversible levels. But can they do it? To help pull that question apart, I'm joined by Brian Pottle and Lisa Koper-Kwaluk. They are both part of the delegation heading to COP26. Brian is president of the National Inuit Youth Council, an organization that was established by Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. Lisa is vice president of international affairs with the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, or ICC, an international non-government organization representing about 180,000 Inuit of Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia. Hello, greetings to both of you.
Hi, Rosanna. Good to be here.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Now, you both represent Inuit from many geographical locations, but I want to hear a bit about the place you call home. Brian, let's start with you. Where were you raised?
I was raised actually in Nunatsiavut, the northern portion of Labrador, where I spent my formative years, and that's where I would consider home, even though I've been living in St. John's, Newfoundland for the last decade.
And how would you describe being raised there? As a prairie girl myself, I have no idea. So paint me a picture of what it was like to be raised in Labrador.
Absolutely. My pleasure. So it's putting up with a lot of flies in the summer and extreme cold in the winter, which, as I'm sure in the prairies you're familiar with, the extreme cold aspect. But there was a lot of living, going out on the land, a lot of playing in the woods, exploring your backyard, basically being, kind of forest, and just being able to view the world in a much more foundational way than my children are growing up in St. John's. I had way more freedom, and it's funny. There's all those pros written about taking to the open road on, say, a motorcycle or a car, but it's funny because those roads are inherently constrained. They're pre-engineered, they're pre-designed, and by contrast, growing up in Labrador in the winter, especially when you can actually explore on snowmobile, the whole land and ice it's all open. It's all for exploring.
That sounds pretty epic, Brian. So how has the experience, your experience of living there, impacted the way you speak about and for Inuit?
Well, So I grew up in both Postville and Rigolet in Labrador and Nunavut. And I guess just by virtue of the fact that I grew up in the Inuit communities, I'm very cognizant of the Inuit way of life, the Inuit culture, living on the land, being respectful of the land. It's, of course, greatly contrasted with the more individualistic approach, the more individualistic way of life that I see in kind of quote Western society, end quote.
Lisa, how about you? Where do you call home?
Yes, my home. I've lived away from home for many, many years, but I always return home. So that's in Puvirnituk on the Hudson Bay coast. And I was born there and grew up also in different communities as I was raised by my grandparents. And my grandfather, Isa, was an Anglican minister. So we lived in Angava Bay as well, Hudson Bay, and I grew up speaking only Inuktitut at home and spoke two dialects because the Angava dialect and Hudson Bay dialect are a little bit different. Nowadays, we fully understand each other with all our communications technology being available to us, but Hudson Bay is tundra, and in winter it's white, covered with snow. And Puvirnituk is also the name of the river, which our small community of today, 1,800 Inuit, is sitting on the shore of the Puvirnituk River. It flows out to the Hudson Bay, and the Hudson Bay is not far from there. So there are small tides that go in and out on our community, but in the Angava Bay, there are very high and very low tides. So there's a huge difference between the two. And I grew up going to school, elementary schools there, went up to like grade 6 at that time. And then I'd be home every Christmas, and there were Christmas festivities and activities, games and things. And then summer was the time where we would go camping for several weeks on an island on the Hudson Bay. And so that's where I grew up.
And what a lovely description. I just love that. And people who haven't been to the north, they think, well, there's snow and ice there. But you've described very different places that are still Inuit homeland. Is there a certain person or community that comes to mind for you, specifically when you think about the effects of climate change on Inuit people? Or Inuit, I guess I just said people, but
Yes, that's true. Often we say, well, it's redundant to say Inuit people because it's saying the same thing twice. So you're right. A few persons that I consider as role models in my life. The very first person was the man who raised me. That was my grandfather, and who raised me with values that come from his ancestors, in valuing our ancestors' names and the hard work they went through in thriving and loving their land and their world and their culture. When I think of a particular person that has influenced me in my life, it was him, because of his acknowledgement of the uniqueness of our culture. And he was always proud of that. Mm-hmm.
And what about for you, Brian? Is there a person or a community that you think about when you think about the effects of climate change?
Oh, absolutely. So both my grandfathers on my mother's and father's side, they are both hunters and trappers. And so it was, integral source of income for them while I was a child, for them to harvest their furs and check their traps and traversing the land, the ice, going along places that You require a consistently safe ice to travel. That's a part of their knowledge and experience of where it's safe to go. And thinking about how, as the climate changes, as ice patterns become more unpredictable, and you have a shortening of the winter season, thinking about how that kind of lifestyle, I mean, obviously right now it's heavily impacted because of the moratorium on fur trade in Europe and whatnot, but it's even more tragic thinking about how, even irrespective of that, that way of life is threatened. That source of revenue and meat and sustenance is heavily impacted by virtue of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Now, your organizations come together to raise a unified voice on issues such as climate change, and you're doing again with this delegation of Inuit heading to COP26. Lisa, why is that coordinated effort important?
It's very important. The Inuit Circumpolar Council is the place where Inuit from different countries who fall under various jurisdictions, even within one country itself, we fall within various different jurisdictions. And the borders that were created and that separated us with invisible lines played a huge role in establishing this united voice, the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And having a united voice brings us greater strength. Together with a stronger voice, we can be heard and say, well, listen, this is who we are, and take note. Mm-hmm. Climate change is impacting our communities much greater than it is impacting those countries that are causing climate change. And so you have to hear us. And you have to take into account all the knowledge that we've developed over centuries and generations are what have brought us here. And we have knowledge about our oceans and the coastal areas, the marine regions, the migrations and comings and goings of new species and older species. So the international fora, this is where we really want to gather together and show the world who we are, what we have to say, and the importance of the international world in protecting the Arctic environment and the marine environment as well.
Yeah. What do you think it's going to take for the world to understand that Inuit already have, the knowledge and the ability to do something, to take real action on climate change? What is it going to take, Lisa?
There's a need for the international community to begin understanding that we have the inherent rights to self-determination. We have the right to participate in governance, in decision-making over issues that touch upon our homeland. So it's going to take education. It's also a step-by-step approach. And it takes a long while for people who are used to having power and control over areas to keep that control. And it takes a lot of voicing to allow people to understand what our rights are. And the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People outlines clearly all of the rights that we have. And that includes the inherent right to self-determination. So that means taking part in decision-making processes and having, our voice heard. There are several impacts that we are experiencing. I was just at home in Puvalnituk, for example, this past summer to spend time camping out on our ancestral lands. And it was absolutely really good to get back where I came from. And then I went back again in October, where normally we start seeing ice forming along the bays, right by the shore. And in October, there was none of that. And normally it's snowing heavily in October, and there's a lot of snow, and usually the snowstorms are starting October, November, but there was absolutely no snow. It's only 3 days ago that the first snowfall happened in Puvalnito. And my uncle, one of my uncles told me, normally by October, we see ice crystals starting to form in the bays. We call them haingwit. And we have names, terminology for ice and snow when it appears right at the beginning of the bay and at the mouth of the bay and so on and so forth. So that had not even happened yet this month.
You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. I'm speaking with Brian Pottle and Lisa Koper-Koluk, two members of a delegation of Inuit at COP26, bringing a unified voice from the Arctic. Brian, why is it important that youth have a voice on this delegation?
The youth voice is extremely important because as we proceed into the future, the youth of today will be the leaders of tomorrow, right? So from that lens, then, it becomes very important to include the contemporary youth perspective, because a lot of youth are really feeling the burden, and it's not really theirs to shoulder at this point, of making the world sustainable long term, and making sure that the impacts of climate change are mitigated through their own actions, whatever actions they can take right now. So from that perspective, the youth voice is vital to informing the leaders of today so that the leaders of tomorrow are able to better act.
Now, I understand that some of the other work that you do is you're involved in youth suicide prevention. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's a very close to home topic for me, for sure.
And do you think that these two very serious issues are connected?
Well, of course. So for me, growing up, a key element of my childhood was being able to go out and explore the land and go out on, for example, in the winter, travel down the bay on the ice for like boil ups with my friends, and just be on the land, be basically with the land. And as climate change is affecting people's ability to go out and actually explore, actually travel, and remind themselves of the connectedness that Inuit have historically and still contemporarily have with the land, if that connection is severed, then obviously a very vital aspect of Inuit culture, of connectedness and spirituality, is just gone.
Yeah. And in turn, that, of course, affects mental health, etc.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Is that something that you're going to be sharing at the conference?
Oh, absolutely. Because not only does this impact youth, of course, it also impacts all Inuit, anybody who get a source of comfort and groundedness from being connected to the land. Like personally myself, I find that very empowering to be able to go out and kind of decompress. It's really cathartic process to be able to go out on the land, especially in the winter, like I said, with the snowmobiles, where you can experience almost true freedom effectively. And if that is threatened, if that's taken away, then you're going to have people who feel more trapped and more restricted in life. And in a situation where you're already very far north, you're very far removed from the society you see on social media and whatnot, the more disconnected you are, the greater the mental health risks increase.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, do you agree that, climate change and issues like this are very closely connected to cultural survival, and that we're headed down a very dangerous path by not understanding the two are linked?
Yes, I agree. Absolutely. And I told you about my grandfather and why did I look up to him Well, whenever I think of him, I think of all the knowledge that he had of the land, of the marine region, of animal species around us, and the laws, our family laws, our kinship relations that he promoted, Inuit art that he promoted. He was a wonderful sculptor, and he also encouraged his sisters and other Inuit women to continue practicing throat singing and so on. So he was an Indigenous knowledge holder. And as that Indigenous knowledge holder, he valued that knowledge. He valued our history. And this is what we promote at Inuit Circumpolar Council, is the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in research, in international research, in agreements. For example, there is an agreement for the prevention of unregulated fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. And there's a provision in there now, and it's new, that Indigenous knowledge has and will be taken into account in that agreement. And so United Nations Declaration, once again, on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, acknowledges the importance of Indigenous knowledge as well. So when we participate in research in the Arctic, when international fora are doing research in the Arctic, or researchers come to the Arctic to do research among Inuit, then we insist that Indigenous knowledge is incorporated in that research, and that the research has to be useful to Inuit communities.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, you've been fighting for Inuit for years, taking your voice to previous climate summits, speaking out for women, self-determination, applying your expertise to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. How do you feel about the progress, if any, that's been made in your lifetime of work?
I think progress is done from one generation to another. Previous Inuit leadership has come a long way, and then there's the next generation of leadership that's happening now that wants to bring Inuit self-determination further. The Canadian government has done, I think, a lot to recognize our inherent right to self-determination. And yet we have to deal with colonization still. We have to deal with things that were taken away from us, and we have to fight to get those back. Our self-determination.
Yeah.
Control of justice, for example, based on Inuit law, for example. I mean, that's going to be still a long way off, because a lot of people don't understand, for example, what Inuit law is.
Yes, I was just going to say, you just blew somebody's mind, Lisa.
Yes. Yes.
Inuit law, what?
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's a lot of intellectual work to be done at that level, but because Inuit law is in our daily life. And it's living, it's in our communities. We might think that it's the Western-based law that, controls the daily aspects of justice for us, but that's not entirely true. So for me, progress is really also for our own communities to come up to that level of understanding that it's not just Western law that will control our lives, but we have our own laws. But we just need to acknowledge in some specific way that these are very positive for us, and that we are going to base our self-determination and governance on those laws and on that Indigenous knowledge. But not only that, but we because we are good partners, because we like to collaborate, we take what's good from the Western world, but we also take the maximum best out of our own world. Yes.
Brian, this is clearly such a critical moment for the earth and, everyone that lives here, animals and, all our relations. But you mentioned earlier that this fight to halt, the climate change effects is kind of been laid at the feet of your generation. How do you feel about that and about the future?
It's a very complicated feeling for sure, because part of me, so my background is, I'm a person of science. I'm an engineer by trade, minored in physics. So I'm all about data and data-driven answers. And the data I've been seeing, it's not good, right? On the forecasted effects of climate change. Even in the best case scenarios, we're still looking at very substantial change, melting of glacier ice, permanent ice formations around the poles of the Earth, increasing water levels, those kinds of things. So all those trends are overwhelmingly negative in terms of the implications as it relates to the entire globe, but especially, as Lisa mentioned before, Inuit, a population a demographic that has thrived in otherwise inhospitable elements. The Inuit have devised through generations of knowledge, ways of living and thriving in these historically hostile climates and parts of the world. So as the world continues to heat up, as ice formation continues to be impacted and permafrost is no longer a thing or starts to recede more northerly or southerly, depending on what part of the world you're in, it's terrifying. Mm-hmm. Like the future is terrifying. No matter how you look at it, all we can hope for at this point is that drastic action is taken to mitigate those effects. There's no halting it. I think at this point, there's only stymieing the progression of climate change, of the warming of the Earth.
And now, so you're heading to Scotland with that very important mission. What would success look like for you, Brian?
So success is just making sure that the voice of Inuit youth is heard, on an international level. It's like Lisa was saying, historically, the Inuit perspective has been effectively stonewalled from a lot of policy making and decision making procedures. Mm-hmm. And obviously, Inuit are on the ground feeling these effects. And therefore, any decision needs to be informed by the demographic that are experiencing to a very extreme degree the impacts of climate change. So making sure that Inuit voices are heard is the main goal here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Lisa, what about you?
Yes.
What would success look like for you?
I completely agree with Brian. It's so true what he's saying. Success to me is the parties to the conference, the convention, really coming up with concrete measures to say, okay, this is what we're going to do to reduce the warming of our climate, because there are concrete actions that can be done. Changing, for example, the engines of ships that pass through Arctic waters so that, they adapt their engines to use cleaner fuels, let's say cleaner fuels, although they're not so healthy if they should be spilled into Arctic waters. Well, why not take those measures now rather than 20 years from now or 10 years from now? It's so important to acknowledge that we need to protect our air. We need to stop this fast rate of warming of our planet, and we need to do it now. So success to me is countries that are taking concrete actions right now to make those changes and to also partner with us. So that's another form of success. And partnering with us means also providing resources for our participation in those decision-making organizations and allowing us to have a voice in those organizations.
Lisa, Brian, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. Best of luck at COP26.
Thank you, Rosanna.
Yes, thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Brian Pottle and Lisa Coppercolluke are in Glasgow right now, representing Inuit at COP26. We spoke with them just before they left for Scotland. Tune into CBC Radio's What on Earth tomorrow to hear why one Indigenous leader thinks being at COP is a waste of time and why others think it's essential. That's it for Unreserved this week. This episode was produced by Kim Kasher and Aaron Knoll. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thanks for listening. Ginaskna mitnawi. Egusay.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.